Mrs. Johnston here, and it is time for Knowledge and Social Studies. We are beginning a new unit, Unit 6, on Native Americans. Native Americans were the first known people to live on the continents of North and South America. Another term for Native American is American Indian. Although we use the terms Native American or American Indian when we talk about them, there are many different groups of Native Americans. These groups are called tribes. Each group or tribe has its own way of eating, dressing, and living, depending on where they live in North or South America. Today, you are going to hear about many Native American tribes, but over the next several days, you are going to hear about three in particular: the Lakota Sioux, the Wampanoag, and the Lenape. Let's check for understanding about our introduction. Thumbs up if this answer is yes. Thumbs down if this answer is no. Native Americans were the first known people to live in North America. You should have gave Mrs. Johnston a thumbs up. A tribe is a group of people who live together and share similar ways of eating, dressing, and living. That too should have been a thumbs up. There are many different Native American tribes in North and South America. That too should have been thumbs up. Even though there are many Native American tribes, each group or tribe has similar needs. All tribes need food, clothing, and shelter to stay alive. But each tribe has its own way of eating, dressing, and living, depending on where it lived. Different places have different types of weather. New England is often very cold, where California is often has mild weather and sunny there. Where we live affects what we eat, the types of houses we live in, and the kinds of clothes we wear. Share with who you are working with today, mom and dad, brother and sister, grandma and grandpa. Discuss these questions. What do you need to stay alive? What kind of food do you eat? What kind of clothes do you wear? How does where you live affect what you eat and wear? I know I probably did not give you enough time to discuss that, and you can pause the video to further discuss. But let's find out the answers to the questions about Mrs. Johnston. What does Mrs. Johnston need to stay alive? Well, I need food, water, air, shelter, clothing. What kind of foods do I eat? I eat spaghetti. I eat steak, potatoes, corn. What kind of clothes do I wear? I wear blue jeans, dresses, sweatshirts. So, how does where I live affect what I eat and wear? I eat local crops that are grown, like potatoes and corn, and meat from animals that are grown on farms locally, like steak or bacon or pork chops. And depending on the season, affects what I wear. In the winter time, I wear snow pants, boots, jacket to keep me warm. But in the summer, I wear shorts and bathing suits. Today's story is called The Introduction to Native Americans. Listen to find out what some different tribes or Native Americans wore, what they ate, and what kind of houses they lived in. Long, long ago, long before you and I can remember, long before your grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents can remember, there were no people living on the land where we live today. There were woods and plains, but no people. There were rivers and lakes, but no people. There were deserts and mountains, but no people. A desert is a large, dry area of land that gets very little rain. There were plenty of birds and fish, and animals and insects, but there were no people. But that was thousands of years ago, much earlier than any of us can remember. The first known people who lived in America, called Native Americans or American Indians, lived in all parts of the continent. Some lived in the desert, others lived in the mountains, some lived in the woods, and others lived on the coast near the ocean. The coast is the land next to the ocean or sea. People of the desert lived very differently from coastal people. Can you guess why that would be? Did you respond with some of the answers, like they would have access to different types of food? We know that there are fish and lobsters and squid in the ocean, but they do not live in the desert. So people that were in the desert had access to different types of food. Also, the weather is different. It is hot in the desert, so the clothing that the Native Americans wore would have been very different from those that lived near the coast. You are going to learn about some of the different ways Americans, first known people, or Native Americans lived. The Native Americans of long ago all needed the same things we need today. They needed food and water to stay alive. They needed shelter, places to protect themselves from the weather and wild animals. And they needed clothing to keep themselves warm and dry. But the food the desert people ate was not the same kind of food the coastal people ate, and the houses that protected people in the woods did not look the same as the houses of those who lived in the desert. Some lived in teepees. Some lived in wetus. Some lived in hogans. Some lived in pueblos. And others lived in long houses. Native Americans of long ago had to rely on their knowledge of nature, of the earth, the plants, and the animals that surrounded them. And everywhere they roamed or wandered, these Native Americans found ways to borrow or use from the earth all that they needed to live. To borrow means to take or use something for a while and then return it. Some Native Americans grew their own vegetables and fruit. Others hunted buffalo. Some Native Americans hunted woodland animals. Others caught fish from rivers, lakes, and oceans. Some Native Americans cooked their food over an open fire. Others baked food in specialty made ovens. The Native Americans also needed water, but there were no sinks with running water inside their homes. So, where do you think the Native Americans found water long ago? Did you say lakes, rivers, ponds, streams? Native Americans collected rainwater. They also got their water from lakes, rivers, and streams. Native Americans of long ago did not have cars and trucks. There were no buses or trains or planes. So, do you know how they got around? Long ago, Native Americans traveled by foot. Here, the word foot is being used to describe the part of your body that is at the end of your leg. There were no paved roads. Native American paths were made by the pounding of their own footsteps and the hooves of animal herds. After Native Americans were here for many years, they started riding horses. After that, some traveled on horseback, and others traveled in canoes. Those who lived in the woods used their feet to make their way through the thick forests of trees. After many years, those who lived on open plains welcomed the speed of horses to carry them long distances, and those who lived near lakes and rivers relied upon canoes to carry them across the waters. What do you see in this picture? Did you respond with colorful clothing, Native Americans, adults, babies, young children? No matter where they lived, Native Americans made all of their own clothes. Some Native American women and girls wore skirts and dresses. Men and boys often wore breechcloths and leggings. They used materials from their surroundings to make their clothes. What do you see in this picture? Did you say men, a boy, clothing, some colors on the clothing, but most of the clothing in browns or blacks or grays? Some Native Americans wore clothing made of animal skins, elk, deer, buffalo, and rabbit. They often decorated their clothing with beads, porcupine quills, and fringe. During the cold winter months, they wore coats of animal fur to stay warm. Others wore clothes made from the soft inner bark of the cedar tree, sometimes decorated with seashells. What do you see in this picture? Did you say more clothing? Still, others wore clothing made from fibers from different plants, cotton and yucca, and trimmed with animal bones. In winter, they covered themselves with cloaks to stay warm. Many men, women, boys, and girls in each of the Native American tribes across the land, from the oceans to the plains to the woodlands, wore moccasins on their feet. Tribes are groups of similar people who share a language, customs, and laws. They also have the same ancestors, such as great great grandparents. Some, however, preferred bare feet. And so you see the people who first came to live on this rich and varied land that we now call the United States of America were just as rich and varied as the land itself. They were alike in some ways and different in other ways, just as the people of America are today. Did all Native Americans of long ago live in the same place? Was your response no? If your response was no, you are correct. So, where did the Native Americans live? Did you remember or say the coast, on the plains, or in the desert? If you did, you were listening to the details of the story. What three things do all people, including the Native Americans, need to live? Did you say that all people need food, clothing, and shelter? If you did, great job. What kinds of houses did Native Americans live in? Many of you probably said teepees. That's one of the easier ones. But Native Americans lived in many kinds of houses, including teepees, weetus, hogans, pueblos, and longhouses. Did you say some of the other ones that are not so common? How did Native Americans of long ago get their food? Did you say they farmed or hunted and fished depending on where they lived? How did Native Americans of long ago get water? Did you respond with one of these answers? They got water from streams, lakes, rivers, and the rain. What kinds of things did the Native Americans of long ago use to make clothes? Did you say that the Native Americans used animal skins, trees, and plants to make clothes? Were you able to answer all of Mrs. Johnston's questions? Some of them? None? I hope you enjoyed hearing our introduction to Native Americans today.